Welcome, everybody, to Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library. A quick note before we start. This session is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube with a link on our website, ICSSmarx.org, posted within the next few days. In pre-pandemic times, this weekly program was hosted at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library located in Oakland, California, USA. During the pandemic, we've been meeting every Sunday on Zoom. So in fact, we should say good morning, good evening, good afternoon. We now have attendees from throughout the United States and even around the world. My name is Alan Miller, and I'm a member of the program committee that organizes Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library sessions. And I'd like to start off by saying that we always welcome input, feedback, suggestions for topics, and speakers. You can sign up for our email notifications for our meetings and contact us through our website at ICSSmarx.org. For over a decade and a half, Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library programs have been a platform for diverse presentations on a variety of topics, such as political economy, capitalism, socialism, communism, supporting the struggles of the working class, the fight against imperialism, militarism and war, the environmental movement, and the fight for racial and gender justice. We wish to remind you all that this is a comradely forum for political discourse and debate. And as such, we ask that you show respect to our participants and the moderator of today's session. Please note that the opinions expressed are those of the speakers and the participants, not necessarily the Marxist Library or the ICSS. However, we are united in our respect for the work of Karl Marx, and we believe that his work remains relevant today. Our motto is taken from Karl Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Today's talk is on the comprehensive crisis in the US and the revolutionary way forward. Our speaker today is Carlos Garrido, is a Cuban American PhD student and instructor in philosophy at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. His research focuses include Marxism, Hegel, early 19th century socialism, and socialism with Chinese characteristics. He's an editor of the Midwestern Marx Institute for Marxist Theory and Political Analysis and the Journal of American Socialist Studies. As a political analyst with a focus on Latin America, especially Cuba, he has appeared in dozens of radio and video interviews around the world. He also edited and wrote the introduction to Marxism and the Dialectical Materialist Worldview, an anthology of classical Marxist texts on dialectical materialism, published by Midwestern Marx Publishing Press in 2022. Before we start, you may recall that Carlos was scheduled to speak last month, but told us that he had to cancel at the last minute due to pressing personal matters. We asked Carlos to provide verification for his reasons for cancellation. So he supplied them. I want to actually show them to you right now, if you'll bear with me for a moment. And here is the reason why. And Carlos, you might want to explain a little bit further. So why don't you go ahead, Carlos, and take it away.
Well, yeah, this little critter was supposed to come into the world November 15th, and he surprised us a bit early. It interrupted the weekend that I was supposed to present, but it was a wonderful interruption. And it's a testament to dialectics that lack of sleep, which always made me so unhappy, has for some reason sustained. While having so much lack of sleep, I've yet been so happy with the baby. And this was a picture that was taken yesterday. I had to do an interview on the book, and it was the the dress rehearsal. He farted on me, and it felt like the sort of dress rehearsal for what the bowel movement, the bowel revolution that came afterwards. But it's been a wonderful new experience for me and my wife, and very happy for the interruption that it provided.
Well, on behalf of the library, we want to say that we accept your apology and wish you, you and your wife and your family all the best. Congratulations. So
Thank you.
take it away and do your talk.
Okay. So as Alan mentioned, my talk today is on the comprehensive crisis in the U.S. and the revolutionary way forward. The U.S. tells the world and its citizenry that it is the best country on the planet, where freedom and democracy reign, and where an American dream exists, which affords all the opportunity to live flourishing middle-class lives with white picket fence homes and 2 automobiles. However, for the American working masses, as the great comedic critic George Carlin noted, it's called the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it. When awake, what the American masses experience is the American nightmare, lives plagued by stagnant wages, inflation, and various forms of crippling debt. In the era of an empire in decline, the inhabitants of the belly of the beast find their conditions more and more unbearable. What the American working class is experiencing is an era of comprehensive crisis, which has infiltrated every sphere of the capitalist mode of life. The Marxist position on social revolution recognizes that there are 2 central factors or conditions which must exist for a revolution to take place. The first are the objective conditions, or what is referred to as a revolutionary situation. The second are the subjective conditions, which correspond to the consciousness and organization of the working masses and the vanguard party. In this essay, I will argue that the objective conditions for revolution are largely present in the US, and that whatever might be missing will arrive with the forthcoming general crisis of capital, expected to hit sometime in the next 2 years. However, I will argue that the emergence of the subjective conditions are fettered by the purity fetish which prevails in the socialist movement. Since it is the militants in this movement which are tasked with bringing the masses into the struggle for socialism, the overcoming of this purity fetish presents the precondition for a successful counter-hegemonic project. Lenin and the experience of the Bolshevik Revolution shows that the role of the vanguard fighter can be fulfilled only by a party that is guided by the most advanced theory. It is dialectical materialism, that outlook which Engels called Marxism's best working tool and sharpest weapon, which can both cure the purity fetish of the socialist movement and afford it the means to realize its historically revolutionary role. Objective conditions in the US. Okay. There are a plethora of factors which, when analyzed comprehensively, can point to the existence of objectively revolutionary conditions in the US. Since the late 1970s, as the Economic Policy Institute reports, wages for the bottom 70% of earners have been essentially stagnant, and between 2009 and 2013, real wages fell for the entire bottom 90% of the wage distribution. In no state in the US is the federal minimum wage, $7.25 an hour, enough to survive. Even if it is raised to $15, as the Democratic Socialists and other progressives have called for, the minimum wage would still not be enough for a working class family to survive anywhere in the country. With stagnant wages and inflation at a 40-year high, almost 60% of Americans are currently living paycheck to paycheck. Many of these are on the brinks of joining the 600,000 homeless people wandering around in a country with more than 17 million empty homes. It is not surprising, in a country where there are 33 times more empty homes than homeless people, that 34 million people, including 1 in 8 children, experience hunger, while 30 to 40% of the US's food supply, which is 40 million tons of food, is wasted every year. As it becomes more difficult for working class Americans to survive, more and more have been forced to turn to borrowing. Currently, the average American has $52,940 worth of debt across mortgage loans, home equity lines of credit, auto loans, credit card debt, student loan debt, and other debts. Additionally, because the US is the only developed country in the world without universal health care, the commodification of medicine has left more than half of Americans with such crippling medical debt that many of them have been prevented from buying a home or saving for retirement. This same for-profit healthcare system found it unprofitable to take the measures necessary to properly prepare for the COVID pandemic, the result of which has been that the US, while being 4% of the global population, accounts for more than 16% of the COVID deaths. Meanwhile, socialist China, while only having a tiny fraction of the deaths found in the US, has 4 times as many people. And that tiny fraction, to be specific, is 0.49%. Although the US's post-World War II rise to the dominant imperialist force in the world afforded it the means to plunder its way into becoming the richest country on the planet, what one finds today is a decrepit empire with crumbling infrastructure consistently rated in the D range. While more than half of federal spending goes to sustaining the world's most expensive military, spending more than the next 10 countries combined, many cities in the US, inhabited by millions of Americans, lack access to clean drinking water. Additionally, the US has been experiencing a historic decline in life expectancy, so much so that today the average Cuban, despite 6 decades of illegal blockades and hybrid warfare against their socialist project, lives around 3 years more than the average American. The hardships faced by the American people are intensified by the experience of living in one of the most economically unequal societies in human history, where even by conservative numbers, the top 0.1% hold roughly the same amount of wealth as the bottom 90%. In the US, the richest 59 Americans own more wealth than the poorest half of the population. That is 165 million people. While the majority of working class Americans face difficulties in meeting their everyday needs, the richest monopolists in the country, those who own what we watch, buy, and eat, have been getting richer than ever before. However, the crisis most Americans are facing is not limited to their economic conditions. It is, instead, a comprehensive crisis, which has rippled into all spheres of life, expressing itself through profound psychological and social ills. These can be seen in the millions affected by the opioid epidemic, in the rise of violent crime rates and school shootings, and in the mental health crisis where nearly a third of American adults are struggling with depression and anxiety. All of these conditions are expected to be worsened by the forthcoming financial crisis and, of course, by the climate crisis and its effects, the effects it will produce in terms of migration and resource scarcity in various parts of the world. For more than a decade, studies from bourgeois institutions have themselves confirmed what Marxists have known since the middle of the 19th century, namely, that the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. The US, which spreads its blood-soaked hands around the world, plundering in the name of democracy, has been ousted as a place where the demos, the common people, do anything but rule, kratos. As a recent Ivy League study done by Martin Gillens and Benjamin I. Page show, quote, "In the United States, our findings indicate the majority does not rule, at least not in the causal sense of actually determining policy outcomes. When a majority of citizens disagree with economic elites or with organized interests, they generally lose. Moreover, because of the strong status quo bias built in the US political system, even when fairly large majorities of Americans favor policy change, they generally do not get it," end quote. Far from being the beacon of democracy it fancies itself to be, what the US has, in the words of Lenin, is a democracy for an insignificant minority, a democracy for the rich, which is the essence of bourgeois democracy. In other words, what it actually has is an oligarchy. However, the American people, burdened by the conditions of moribund imperialism, have been catching up to the lies pundits and ideologues disseminate to sustain bourgeois hegemony. The US has some of the lowest voter turnout rates in the developed world. Around 40% of the population eligible to vote does not participate in presidential elections. And in local elections, this number increases to around 73%. More than 60% of Americans are dissatisfied with the two-party system and are ready for third-party alternatives. And only around 20% approves of what Congress does. Naturally, it is difficult to participate in a political process one does not feel represented in. However, our two imperialist parties have reacted to this public dissatisfaction by cracking down on voting rights and on the ability for third parties to be on the ballot, That's something both the Democrats and the Republicans have been doing. In addition, only 11% of Americans trust the media, 90% of which has been consolidated under the control of 6 companies. Considering the aforementioned state of the American people, it is not surprising that despite countless resources dedicated to propagandize them against socialism, more than 40% of adults have a favorable view of socialism, and amongst millennials, polls show that 70% would vote for a socialist candidate. In his pamphlet, The Collapse of the Second International, Lenin describes the symptoms of a revolutionary situation in the following manner, quote, "What generally are the symptoms of a revolutionary situation? We shall certainly not be mistaken if we indicate the following 3 major symptoms. When it is impossible for the ruling classes to maintain the rule without any change, when there is a crisis in one form or another amongst the upper classes, a crisis in the policy of the ruling class, leading to a fissure through which the discontent and indignation of the oppressed classes burst forth. For a revolution to take place, it is usually insufficient for the lower classes not to want to live in the old way. It is also necessary for the upper classes to be unable to live in the old way. 2, when the suffering and want of the oppressed classes have grown more acute than usual. And 3, when, as a consequence of the above causes, there is a considerable increase in the activity of the masses, who uncompromisingly allow themselves to be robbed in peacetime, but in turbulent times are drawn both by the circumstances of the crisis and by the upper classes themselves into independent historical action. Without these subjective changes, which are independent of the will not only of individual groups, but of parties and even individual classes, a revolution, as a general rule, is impossible." End quote. These conditions constitute the objective factors one can generally find in a social revolution. In essence, as Lenin later stated in Left-Wing Communism, revolution is impossible without a nationwide crisis affecting both the exploited and the exploiters. We have seen in the assessment above how the American masses are suffering more than usual, and additionally, how poll after poll has shown that they are unwilling to continue to live in the old way. And this is seen in the immense disapproval of Congress and the 2-party system. These conditions are developing into what Gramsci called a crisis of authority, namely, the moment of a crisis when the ruling class has lost its consensus and is no longer leading, but only dominant. As he famously said, the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. However, the masses' dissatisfaction and their inability to live in the old way does not exhaust, as Lenin noted, all the conditions for an objectively revolutionary situation. First, the masses must not only be dissatisfied with the idea of continuing to live in the old way, they must also show willingness to act. And secondly, the ruling classes must themselves be shaken by the crisis and in a position where they too cannot continue to rule in the old way. The willingness of the dissatisfied masses to act can be seen in a variety of places. From the 2020 summer uprisings, where 25 to 35 million Americans protested the racist police state following the murder of George Floyd, to the 2021 Striketober wave, where hundreds of thousands of workers went on strike, to the mass unionization efforts coming from Starbucks workers, Amazon workers, which is the second largest employer in the US, and other industries. However, all of these have been spontaneous movements, some less ephemeral than others, which have been largely unable to be elevated to the level of revolutionary consciousness and organization. They represent, nonetheless, the prime matter with which a revolutionary organization may form a successful mass struggle for power. Have any of these conditions shaken the American ruling class? Do they find themselves unable to rule in the old way? Our response should be a resolute yes. The American empire, with its 900 bases around the world, used to be able to overthrow governments outside of its imperial sphere of influence with relative ease. In the international community, especially after the overthrow of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Socialist Bloc, it achieved unparalleled global hegemony, only opposed in the 1990s by Cuba and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. All things in this world, however, are in a constant state of flux, and sooner or later, it was expected that the end of history would itself end, and that the US and NATO imperialist unipolarity would be challenged. It is our era of flowering multipolarity which marks the fall of the American empire, and with it, the ability of its rulers to rule in the old way. Imperialism, it must be remembered, is not a separate political military phenomenon governed by the set of foreign policies that a nation takes. Instead, it is a stage of capitalism where the dominance of monopolies and finance capital is established, in which the export of capital has acquired pronounced importance, in which the division of the world amongst the international trust has begun, in which the division of all territories of the globe amongst the biggest capitalist powers has been completed. If the US state, an instrument of American and transnational finance capital, is unable to internationally govern in the ways that it used to, that is, if it is unable to continue the expropriation and superexploitation of the peoples of the world, that is not simply a foreign policy crisis, but a crisis in the integral state. From failed coup attempts in Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and other countries, to the failed Summit of the Americas, to failed proxy wars against Russia and China, it becomes an undeniable fact that the ruling class cannot continue ruling in the old way, that the age of American imperialist unipolarity is over. As the world continues to turn towards China for win-win relations and international trade, as La Patria Grande continues its leftward turn and its hemispheric unity against the US's Monroe Doctrine-style engagement with the region, as movements towards de-dollarization occur across the planet, as European citizens continue to protest the exacerbation of their material conditions by the US and NATO's proxy war against Russia, this crisis in the ruling class will show itself to be more pronounced. Additionally, what greater depiction of this crisis of legitimacy than the fact that both parties over the last two presidential election cycles have committed themselves to challenging the election results? First, with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, a victory, of course, which was garnered while losing the popular vote, the Democrats spent the next 4 years pushing the narrative that Trump colluded with Russia, and even attempted to impeach him over this. This, along with a long-standing history of anti-Soviet and anti-Russia propaganda, set the ideological grounds, especially amongst previously anti-war liberals, for the Russia hysteria and Putin demonization driving the liberal thirst for World War III now. Then, in 2020, the same was done by a significant portion of the Democratic Party and by most of the MAGA base, who argued that the election was stolen by the Democrats. As Marxists know, democracy in liberal bourgeois states is limited to the peaceful transfer of power from one faction of the ruling class to another through elections. Today, we can say that even this superficial appearance of democracy is crumbling. In doing so, we can see here another symptom of the ruling classes not being able to rule in the old way. In essence, by every standard the Marxist tradition uses to assess objectively revolutionary conditions, we can say that the US meets all of them and is heading towards making them only more pronounced in the coming months and years. However, social revolution demands unity of objective and subjective conditions. As Lenin noted, revolution arises only out of a situation in which the above-mentioned objective changes are accompanied by a subjective change, namely the ability of the revolutionary class to take revolutionary mass action strong enough to break or dislocate the old government, which never, not even in periods of crisis, falls if it is not toppled over. I'm going to go into my section on the subjective conditions now. The development of the subjective conditions for revolution is, in essence, synonymous with the development of a successful counter-hegemonic project, that is, with the development of an intellectual and moral vanguard that can win over the masses' minds and hearts to the struggle for socialism. For Gramsci, the starting point of every counter-hegemonic struggle must always be the common sense, which is the spontaneous philosophy of the multitude and which has to be made ideologically coherent by Marxist philosophy. As Jean-Pierre Reid and myself have argued before, the intellectual leaders of a counter-hegemonic project will find that their theoretical weapon, the philosophy of praxis or dialectical materialism, is null in persuading the masses insofar as it does not begin with a critical rearticulation of the popular beliefs the masses already hold. Within the incoherent, fragmentary, and contradictory clusters of beliefs which the masses hold, the intellectual leadership must find the kernels out of which socialist consciousness and emotions may develop. This educative process is comprehensive in character. The intellectual leadership does not simply wish to elevate the masses to a higher conception of life, but to a higher form of life in general. It is a transformation which modifies the outlook the masses have towards the world, and alongside this, changes the masses' desires, their passions, their emotions, and their ethical life. For the ideological and emotive rearticulation of the masses' common sense and feelings, what is required from the intellectual leadership, in other words, the vanguard party, is a dialectical and referential relationship with the masses. In order to successfully educate the masses, the vanguard must be grounded in them. They must learn from the masses and know them concretely. Its relationship with the masses must be active and reciprocal, such that every teacher is always a pupil and every pupil a teacher. The educator, as the young Marx had noted, must himself be educated. This fundamental grounding in the working class is absent in the socialist left in the US. There has been a profound gulf between the working class and socialist organizations, and what has come often to dominate in the latter is what Gus Hall called petty bourgeois radicalism, a mode of political practice and thinking which reflects the interest of the petty bourgeoisie and what Barbara and John Ehrenreich called the professional managerial class. Although it is perfectly fine to include professionals and part of the petty bourgeoisie in the socialist struggle, the base of any socialist organization must be the working masses, not these other classes which, although hurt by state monopoly capital, bring with them class biases, some which are even antagonistic to the working class, into the workers' movement. However, the dominance of the PMC within socialist organizing in the US is not a spontaneous phenomenon. It is grounded on a century of state-sanctioned anti-communist attacks which have purged communists from trade unions and infiltrated socialist organizations to promote factionalism and forms of socialism which are compatible with the existing order. The work of Gabriel Rockhill on the global theory industry shows how, through groups like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the works of classic authors from the New Left and the Western Marxist tradition were propped up by a political economy of knowledge that was and is backed by Western capitalist state departments and intelligence agencies, as well as by major capitalist foundations, which benefit from the dissemination of a compatible anti-communist Marxism which, although critical of capitalism, denounces every socialist experiment seen around the world and justifies the wars of empire from the left when it needs to. From a Gramscian perspective, this shows how controlled forms of counter-hegemony have come to be necessary to sustain the hegemony of the existing order, and how the dominant institutions have been able to get ahead of the discontent capitalism creates by diverting the centers into organizations and pathways of critique which don't substantially threaten capitalist imperialism. These are the material forces grounding what I have labeled as Western Marxism's purity fetish, an integrative term I use to comprehensively examine the abstract, idealist, and metaphysical obsession with only supporting or working with that which is pure, and this is the outlook which I hold dominates Western Marxism. If a large chunk of the working class is socially conservative and henceforth fails to meet all the purity markers of the enlightened PMC left has set as the a priori conditions for approval, they will be rejected as, in the words of Hillary Clinton, a basket of deplorables, or worst, as fascist, incapable of being brought to the socialist movement. For these Marxists, the traditional communist slogan is no longer workers and oppressed people of the world unite. It is socially enlightened workers and oppressed people of the world unite. These Marxists don't see in the millions of working class Americans who voted for Trump a group of people deceived by Trump's shallow and fake anti-establishment discourse. They don't see what is implicit in that vote is a desire for something new, something which can only be brought to them by the socialist movement, not Trump or any bourgeois party. Instead, they see in this large chunk of the working class a bunch of racists bringing forth a fascist threat which can only be defeated by tailing the Democrats, the same Democrats which in large part fund a lot of the more right-wing elements of the Republican Party. Silly as it may sound, this policy dominates the contemporary communist movement in the US. The purity fetish preeminent in Western Marxism forgets that, as Lenin said, one can and must begin to build socialism not with abstract human material or with human material specially prepared by us, but with the human material bequeathed to us by capitalism. Communists cannot pop into existence a pure working class from a void. They must learn how to organize all workers irrespective of the differences the ruling classes foist on the working class to divide them. Communists must understand that the backwardness the working class may have will not be overcome if one ignores them. This would only lead them into the hands of the fascists, who are always a contending force in capitalism's moments of crisis. Instead, it must be acknowledged that only through class struggle can the most backward elements of the working class evolve. This does not mean you tail behind them, but that you understand that because of their class position, they are objectively revolutionary, and therefore that their consciousness and emotions can always be elevated and re-articulated towards socialism. If communists do not have confidence in their ability to convince workers who don't already agree with them to struggle for socialism, how can they consider themselves communists? As Lenin eloquently noted, quote, "It would be an egregious folly to fear this reactionism or to try to evade or leap over it, for it would mean fearing that function of the proletarian vanguard which consists in training, educating, enlightening, and drawing into new life the most backward strata of the masses and the working class and the peasantry. On the other hand, it would be a still graver error to postpone the achievement of the dictatorship of the proletariat until a time when there will not be a single worker with a narrow craft-minded outlook or with craft and craft union prejudices. The task devolving on communists is to convince the backward elements to work amongst them and not to fend themselves off from them with artificial and childishly left slogans," end quote. The purity fetish Marxists, however, see the world statically and through an essentialist framework. They do not understand the struggle for socialism as a process. To them, the forces that exist currently will always remain where and as they are. This outlook is fundamentally antagonistic with the task bequeathed to communists by history, namely, to develop the subjective conditions for revolution. However, this outlook is itself not eternal. It too is subject to change and can be overcome through the development of the dialectical materialist worldview. When one consistently applies in their revolutionary practice the understanding that the world is dominated by change and interconnection, and that if we study the world concretely, we may begin to decipher the forms and structures through which change and interconnections takes place, the anti-dialectical essence of the purity fetish can be overcome. However, the purity fetish manifests itself in a variety of ways. Even if one removes the flawed rejection of swaths of workers for being too impure, the purity fetish infiltrates the analysis of geopolitics and history to the point where it naturally creates fetters for the development of socialist consciousness in the masses. For instance, as I have argued before, for Western Marxists, the triumphant socialist experiments of the 20th and 21st century, in their mistakes and totalitarianisms, desecrate the purity and the holiness of their conception of socialism. The USSR, to them, must be rejected. The Spanish Civil War upheld. Cuban socialism must be condemned, but the 1959 revolution praised. Allende and Sankara are idols. Fidel and Kim Il-sung tyrants, etc. What has died in purity can be supported. What has had to grapple with the mistakes and the pressures that arise out of the complexities and contradictions of building socialism in the imperialist phase of capitalism, that must be condemned. This position has been especially present in the democratic socialist movement, which, for instance, condemned Cuba, China, Venezuela, and Nicaragua as authoritarian in the 2019 Socialism Conference, where some of the hosted panelists received aid from various imperialist organizations, such as the National Endowment for Democracy. This raises an interesting paradox I have previously explored. How can one be a socialist if they genuinely think that each time a socialist or communist party has been in power, it has resulted in great failures? What sort of arrogance is required to claim that everyone in the third world failed at socialism, but we, the virtuous West, we are the ones who will succeed? This position is not only historically false, but revolutionary futile. Why would the working class follow something which has always failed? Instead of this, communists should be using the immense successes achieved by socialism in the Soviet Union, in China, in Cuba, in Bolivia, and in other places as examples for what socialism can achieve even while under the boot of constant hybrid warfare from the global imperialist system. Gramsci's work helps us understand that communists must appeal to the common sense understanding and feelings of the masses, and from there critically re-articulate kernels towards socialism. If rejecting socialist experiments abroad and large chunks of the working class at home was not enough, the purity fetish Marxists add on to their futility in developing subjective conditions for revolution by completely disconnecting themselves from the traditions the American masses have come to accept. Bombastic and ultra-left slogans such as "Abolish America" have become more and more popular in American communist spaces. For them and their one-sided outlook, the US is reducible to settler colonialism, imperialism, exploitation, slavery, and all the crimes of the ruling class and its state. However, in the underbelly of the ruling class's history lies its opposite, a long, arduous history of struggle against various forms of exploitation and oppression. This is the history of figures like Thomas Paine, Thomas Skidmore, John Brown, Frederick Douglass, August Billick, Daniel de Leon, Eugene Debs, Bill and Harry Haywood, Elizabeth Flynn, William Foster, Henry Winston, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Martin Luther King, and thousands more. This is the history further of the abolitionist movement, of the workers' movement, of the suffrage movement, of the various socialist, communist, and anarchist organizations that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th century. This is the history, in essence, of the struggle against capital, the state, and the various tactics used by the ruling class to keep workers divided amongst race, sex, religion, and other factors which hinder the collective class struggle. An honest glance at our history will help one recognize that the country has been composed of a unity of two opposed struggling poles, one which fights to defend the interest of the accumulation of capital, the other which seeks to defend the interest of working and oppressed peoples. The history of those who have fought for socialism, peace, workers' rights, indigenous, Black, and women's rights is not a separate history which stands outside of America and fighting against it. Instead, this history is an imminent extension of the injustices that have permeated our country. The workers who partook in these struggles, in their great majority, saw themselves as the real representatives of the American people and the American values of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, sovereignty, the right to revolution, and the right to a government of, by, and for the people. All values, I think, which can only be achieved under socialism. They saw themselves as taking the progressive side of 1776 and its revolutionary tradition to socialism, what they considered to be its practical and logical conclusion. They were not anti-American or working under slogans such as "Death to America." They saw the owning classes and their state and the various bourgeois apparatuses as the real anti-Americans, as the ones who keep our population alienated, exploited, and oppressed, while periodically sending them to wars abroad where they go to lose limbs and lives fighting people whom they have more in common with than those who sent them to war. If this tradition is forgotten, we will be doing the owning classes a favor, for this is what they have done to the tradition in the history books taught in our schools, where it has either been erased, sanitized, or domesticated. If we ignore this tradition, we tear the historical legs of the socialist movement and yield to what McCarthyism has been erroneously propagandizing the American masses to believe, namely, that socialism and communism are foreign and antagonistic to America. We tear ourselves off from establishing any connection with the masses and their common sense understanding and feelings. No working class person will support a struggle which aims at bringing about the annihilation of their country. They would, however, support the sublation, that is, the overcoming of our present bourgeois state by a worker state. This is how communists in the past, guided by the dialectical materialist outlook, understood their connection to their history and their masses. The qualitative transformation involved in a revolution is never a full-fledged annihilation. Something is always preserved and elevated into the new society. For American communists, this has meant a fight to eliminate the evils of capitalism, imperialism, racism, sexism, and so on, while preserving and having pride in the history of our people, the history our people have in fighting against the former. In conclusion, the US is currently under objectively revolutionary conditions expected only to intensify in the near future. These conditions provide fertile soil for a revolutionary transformation. However, the objective conditions are not enough. The subjective factor, that is, the masses' development and of socialist consciousness with the aid of a revolutionary vanguard is necessary. In the US, the purity fetish which predominates in the outlook of communists presents a fetter to the actualization of this subjective factor. Only by overcoming this outlook can the subjective conditions for revolution develop, and hence can social revolution genuinely be put on the table. This requires, however, three processes to occur. I must note that the following three processes should not be thought of separately, but dialectically. The development in one area simultaneously brings forth the development in another. 1. A process of critical self-reflection by the dominant socialist and communist organizations. These must become aware of their class composition and how the influence of what has been called the iron triangle of academia, the media, and NGOs have come to ground their political culture and purity fetish outlook. 2. Once critical self-awareness has occurred, all efforts should be made to have the working class, not the PMC, be the center and soul of the organizations. And 3, theoretical education must become one of, if not the, central priority. Every cadre should master and be able to consistently approach the world through the dialectical materialist worldview. This cannot be reduced to dogmatic remembering of a few slogans and conclusions which are then copied and pasted from one context to another. To have a genuine transformation of outlook, to be able to approach the world through a dialectical materialist framework is a creative and complex endeavor, one which requires the constant, concrete study of the concrete. This is how we carry the living spirit of Marxism-Leninism into our age and overcome the one-sided extremes of right opportunism and ultra-leftism, which are both but forms through which the purity fetish manifests itself. And that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a short break for announcements. But following that, we're going to open up the session for questions and answers. I would ask those of you who have something to say, have a question to ask, to please go to the bottom of your Zoom window and raise your hand by clicking on the reactions button. So go ahead and please go ahead and do that, and we'll call on people as best we can in the order in which you raise your hand. So before we do that, though, what I'd like to do is ask Jean to do announcements of upcoming programs. So Jean, if you would do that, unmute yourself and please do so.
I hope I'm unmuted. But I was thank you, Carlos. That was superlative and gives us a lot to think about and discuss. And I'm looking forward to that as much as I look forward to your talk. But we do have some good talks coming up. Next week is Thanksgiving, basically weekend. So we're taking a break, but remember, you are what you eat. Moving forward, December 4th, we have a very good discussion on racism, anti-communism, and the CP-USA struggle against both in US history. And our speaker will be
Norman Markowitz.
Speaking, and that's coming up. After that, December 11th, Iran's role in the anti-imperialist struggle with Bahman Ared, a Iranian American police activist and president of the US Peace Council. We're going to take 2 weeks off for, then we're going to go to December 8th, elections Brazil and their global significance. And then we're going to take 2 weeks off and have talks on Marxism and the problems of linguistics, Stalin's work on linguistics. And we're having a talk by John Walsh on China's dynamic zero COVID policy, facts from the East and fictions from the West. And I was just one more thing that I will remind you that about our comrades on the East Coast, the Center for Marxist Education had a very good talk yesterday by Wadia Halabi on the Communist Manifesto's actual title, provides a clue to the fall of the Soviet Union. And that is available. And all this from the Center for Marxist Education in Boston. So all of this information is available on our weekly email announcements. And if you don't receive them, you can sign up for them on our website, ICSSmarx.org, which will also provide you with information on how to donate money to to our endeavor. I hope that covers it, Alan, and back to you.
Thank you, Gene. Yes, I just wanted to remind people that you can sign up for email notifications for future programs by going to our website at ICSSmarx.org. You can also view the videos of past programs at the website. And you can also send us a message if you have any questions or suggestions, anything at all. There's a contact form on the website, and we will respond promptly if you send us a message. There's also information for how to donate, what Gene just mentioned, and the information is up there should you be able and willing to do so. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start on calling on people to ask questions of Carlos. I'm going to ask everybody to please keep your comments and questions down to about 2 minutes or so, to give everybody a chance. And I'm going to try to call on people roughly on the order in which hands are raised, as long as new people are raising their hands. So I'm going to start with Roger Harris, followed by Eric, followed by 338-2841. So Roger, if you would go ahead, please.
Good morning. Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Carlos, for a very interesting presentation, one that is quite thought-provoking. On the subjective factor, there was quite a lot that I agreed with, especially the critique of the social democrats, the problems with ultra-leftism and such, idealism within the subjective element, and we'll see how those things develop. We need a communist party. I think we all agreed on that, but it's on the objective side that I found that I thought the analysis, well, I felt it was like coming from a great place, but it was, in the end, the analysis, I think, was idealistic and not materialist. And I think if we look at other other revolutions, because we have a number of examples of revolutions, I think we'll see that the United States is not quite at the objective level of revolution that you explained. It's pretty hard for me to do that in 2 minutes, but let me just make a few suggestions. There's a lot of quotology about from Gramsci and Lenin, which is good, but how does it apply? And so the question of, is the ruling class right now in a crisis? And I think that there is actually a bedrock consensus within the ruling class right now, and it's not in a crisis situation, which is. And then the other side of that dialectic is the institutions of working class power. When we look at other revolutions, we'll see there's a much more highly organized union density and other institutions of the working class. I think what is being confused here is some sort of amorphous sentiment, like a general idea that maybe socialism is a good idea, but it has not taken a material form yet. That doesn't mean that those contradictions aren't present, but that something like support of socialism or even the dissatisfaction with the government. Well, interestingly enough, in the last presidential election, when the bourgeoisie put forward the two most unattractive candidates you could possibly ever imagine them putting forward, they had record turnout. for the election, showing a kind of a buy-in, that there's a lot of discontent both within Democratic and Republican Party, but that has been contained within those parties, and that the third party movement, which you commended, is actually in precipitous decline. So I think that on the objective side, that we're seeing that the United States is still the ruling hegemon in the world. That doesn't mean that it gets its way all the time, but that objectively we're seeing that their institutions, such as NATO, is growing rather than decreasing. And Alan is cutting me off. Those are some of the things where I would suggest that we're seeing an idealist and not a materialist approach to the objective conditions. Thank you, Carlos.
Okay, Carlos, if you want to respond, take as much time as you need. Go ahead, Carlos.
Thank you for that wonderful question and the challenge. I really appreciate those because it helps the growth of the paper and it helps me think through these things with folks that are far more experienced. I would say one thing, you mentioned the institutions of working class power are not there. I agree. I consider those to be part of the subjective conditions, though, because they deal with the organization and the elevation of the consciousness of the masses. So that's part of what I would consider to be the subjective crisis, which it of course has an objective component to it, which is actual institutions that have to be created. But I do agree with you there. But I consider that not part of the objective conditions, but part of the subjective conditions. You mentioned that there are areas of overlap with our ruling class, that although there's the contesting of elections, there's a lot of areas of overlap. I think that this proxy war being waged against Russia is definitely one of those. And I do agree that there's areas of overlap, but I do think that there's also areas of polarization and crisis as we haven't seen before in a very, very long time. And all of the most recent polls for where the American people are, the driving force behind a lot of the votes is to not get another candidate, to either not get Biden or not get Trump. And that is itself, even in the part of the population that is mobilized to vote, you can tell that there's a level of discontent there where they don't feel represented in the electoral system, and that poll after poll has shown that more than 60% of Americans disagree with the two-party system. They don't feel aligned with either party, and they would like to see third-party alternatives. As far as how third parties have done, the Party for Socialism and Liberation's growth, I think, is something to look at. I'm not in that party, but I think electorally it jumped in a matter of 2 election cycles, and it has gone from each election cycle, it has duplicated the amount of votes. And I think that the development of the Bernie movement, it was within the Democratic Party, but it showed the limits of that social democratic politics that occurs within the Democratic Party. And I think more and more people, specifically young people, who were mobilized and brought to political action through Bernie, are seeing that. So I expect there to be, in the next election cycle, a stronger third party movement, whether it's the Greens, whether it's PSL or some other party. I do think that lack of an alternative is both, it's grounded on the very real battles that are waged by the Republicans, but I think more primarily in this field by the Democrats, to keep third-party alternatives off the ballots. And there's been a lot of states where they've done work in order to get the people that have signed in order to have the Green Party on the ballot, to get them to remove their signature. So there has been a lot of work done to remove the ability for third parties to be on the ballot. But I mean, poll after poll shows that the American people are dissatisfied, and that with the more universalistic, not socialist, but the sort of ideas that Bernie put forward, they're the most popular in the country. So I think in terms of like a minimal program from a third party, there's something that if hard work is done in that area, I think that could win. And just lastly, I do think that the China challenge poses a threat to American imperialism. if you look at the development of China and just the amount of the world that's trading with China and turning away from the US, that's a challenge that the US hasn't seen since the overthrow of the Soviet Union. And that's something that I think we should consider and consider seriously. And, there's 12% of the world that fancies itself the international community, and it's the same former countries that colonized the whole world. And
In a second.
what was that? And we can't take serious their self-positing of themselves as the international community. When we look at the polls of the amount of countries that support NATO's proxy war, NATO and the US's proxy war on Russia, it's a hell of a lot less than those who are critical of it. And the third world seems to be the heart of the critique, but of course it doesn't get, because of history and power and imperialism, it doesn't get the representation that it ought to get just in terms of sheer population. So I do think that the crisis of empire is serious, and if we think of the American state in an integrative fashion, if we don't just separate foreign policy from national policy, that crisis, I think, signifies the inability of the ruling class to rule in the old way.
Okay, next up is Eric. If you would unmute yourself, followed by 2841, followed by Mike Gilbert. So Eric, if you go ahead and ask your question.
First, I'd just like to say that it's excellent presentation. You seem to imply that you're working on this as a paper that you're going to publish. I certainly hope that you do publish what you presented on the internet and not say in some academic journal. I think what you said is important. I've been waiting to hear something like this for a long time. I just virtually nothing that you said that I disagree with. So my only question is, are you going to publish this? And well, actually, I do have a question. What do you think of the People's Party, the Movement for People's Party? I don't know if you're aware of it.
Yes, well, thank you very much. This paper was, it came to fruition because it was requested by a magazine out of the Autonomous National University of Mexico that's associated with the Communist Party over there, which is Revista Memoria, the memory magazine. And the version that I presented today is an extended version of it that we will be putting out in the Journal of American Socialist Studies, which is a journal that is public, and it's published through our institute. And so it would be made available on the internet. I also am a very big critic of the academic paywalls, where you have to pay $40 or something to get an article or have access to the interlibrary loan, which you can only get if you're associated with the university. I'm a very big critic of that, and I think that Marx's theory and work should always be grounded in social struggles, and that if 15 academics are the ones reading it, that's not Marxist theory. You're doing something else there. You're just trying to pad CVs. And no offense to anyone who does that. I have to do that with other forms of work because I am within academia, but I think the important stuff I like to have public. As far as the People's Party, I have heard of it. I think that it developed as a faction of the Bernie movement that wasn't going to toe the line of vote blue no matter who. And I support that, as someone who dedicated countless hours working with Eddie, who spoke here a few weeks ago, working with Eddie in 15-degree Iowa weather, knocking doors, talking to people. I was very disappointed when he just took all the funds that we had donated and just gave them to Biden. And I'm sure a hell of a lot of people who were mobilized by his movement were as well. So I support the efforts of doing something broad like what the People's Party seems to be trying to do. I think that ultimately some form of coalition party like that, if we look at how socialism has succeeded recently in the last few decades in Latin America, I think coalition parties are going to be a big thing, and something named just like the People's Party. It's something that I think will attract a hell of a lot of people. But I do think some form of unity between these parties that have 98% in common and 2% in difference. Parties like the Communist Party, the PSL, organizations like the Freedom Road Socialist Organization or DSA. There's more in common than there is in difference. And I think that coalitions with those parties and with the labor movement, the leading trade unions, could be something that could spring forth a coalition party, that something I think that maybe the People's Party can function as the vehicle for. But yeah, that's.
Okay, next is Rich Johnson, followed by Mike Gilbert, followed by Richard Wright and Raj Sahai. Rich, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello? Okay.
We can hear you.
So, yeah, thank you. So, Carlos, I have to say, in response to Roger's, I actually liked Roger's critique, and I liked your response that you'll take what he said seriously. But I will say that about a few minutes before you finished, I had an emotional breakdown. I started crying for, I say, over a minute, because I was so emotionally. I really appreciated what you said. I couldn't find anything at fault, not meaning there's nothing you can't improve on. I just mean that I've been waiting to hear what you said for a long time, and I hope you have other friends that are as articulate as you are and as advanced as you are that can push that. I will look into your work myself and get past this emotional breakdown I had, which was really healthy. I let out a lot of stuffed up emotions. It was a really healthy thing. So I just can't say thank you enough. I hope your paper publishes and we can read it. I'll listen to this again as soon as we put it out on the internet in a week or so or less. I just can't say anything more. I don't want to be over redundant and take too much time, but thank you very much. And Eddie was fine. It was great. He did the same thing to me, not quite as much as you did, but the pair of you sound like a real force. And I'm glad you're working together and support each other. And your whole thing, your key line of the purity fetish, I absolutely agree with you on that. There's so much, like you said, 98% whatever. There's so much that we have in common with all our comrades out there and with all our friends out there doing this kind of work. I've been doing it for 50 years, and I'm, up and down. I want to say one thing specific that I hold really important to myself, and that is my understanding, which might not be full, of Lenin's What Is to Be Done when they were organizing the Bolshevik Party. And I think that your emphasis on the need for those of us that are trying to be using dialectical and historical materialism as best we can in our actual work, that you've hit a note there. And when we get people that are consciously trying to be conscious, which is a difficult task, and to work directly with the working class and not just in these conversations that we have all the time amongst ourselves, but become more articulate and capable of sharing and learning from the people that we know we need, that are the core of the people that are going to have to make this work happen in the U.S. So thank you very much. Good luck on the future, and I appreciate all your work so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. That means a lot. And we are trying to disseminate this education through our institute in a way that I think breaks with the dominant ways in which Marxism has been spoken of in the dominant Marxist spaces in the West, more particularly in the academy. It obscures things that shouldn't be obscured. And one of the things that we do in our more popular fields of work and like our YouTube video is try to provide everyday examples for things that can help people in an allegorical fashion understand things like the dialectical materialism. I recently did a video where I compared the process of a Bob Ross painting to the process of the dialectical ascension from the abstract to the concrete, and it received a lot of people who felt that those ideas, which were obscured to them, that they didn't really understand it, they felt like the example helped a lot. And we're constantly trying to do it with similar things that people understand and show them how the dialectical materialist worldview is present there, and that you can say things in a way that everyone understands it. I think if you really know things, you should be able to express those things in a way that everyone should be able to grasp it. So in essence, that's really what we're trying to do. But thank you.
Okay, next is Mike Gilbert, followed by Richard Wright, Raj Sahai, and then Peter Fay. So Mike, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I'm participating from Boston in Lincolnshire in Great Britain. So my perspective is a little bit different. It's a bit more Anglo-centric than some of the other colleagues online. But I too have spent a lot of time trying to popularize the ideas of Marxism in a way which is accessible to ordinary working people, because the bourgeois class and the bourgeois political system is very keen, as you've said, to sort of try and minimize the popularity of these ideas, because they challenge the very core of sort of bourgeois economics and bourgeois politics. I've identified a couple of things which are sort of, I guess they could be called modern challenges. And one of the modern challenges I think we face as Marxists today is that in the late 20th century, capitalism in a sense properly failed, in my opinion. But what we ended up with was a kind of neoliberal revival, which took the banks center stage and created a world in which debt-based consumerism became a kind of a new opium of the people, if you like, replacing religion. And in this country, at least, there is still a huge kind of commitment to that debt-based consumer lifestyle, which prevents people achieving that level of radicalism and that collective consciousness that's necessary to see a revolution properly progress. I've written about 5 pamphlets kind of explaining some of this stuff, and so I won't bore you with the details of that. I'll put the link on them, or I'll put a website on the chat. But what I think we need to do is I think we need to explain to people how dialectics basically works in the simplest way possible, that the capitalism created some principles that people in the West have come to enjoy: contract, choice, and consent. We've been told that this underpins our Western civilization, and in a bourgeois context, yes, it certainly does, but not in a Marxist sense. In a Marxist sense, contract, choice, and consent have been utilized to create unfairness, inequality, and elitism. And so what we need to do is try and get our working people to understand the nature of that kind of relationship between those 6 core principles, that their contracts of employment are skewed against their interests. Their choice isn't proper political choice. It's the choice of 2 parties in this country and in your country that are virtually indistinguishable. And so for me, the challenge is to not necessarily be a vanguard who kind of occupies the existing political system, but to actually challenge the authority of the existing political system. So my view, for example, in this country, is that we should get rid of our House of Lords, and we should create a lower chamber that is occupied by people who represent real local communities. Because when you get to that level of political engagement, proper political engagement, then the institutions of capitalism will be forced to adapt and will eventually, I think, be burst asunder, to use Marx's phrase. I just wonder, I mean, there's a long sort of waffling narrative there, a bit of a stream of consciousness. I just wonder whether that chimes with your thoughts on the situation in the States. It sounds like it might do in part.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of overlaps there. I do think the last point you mentioned, like a way of promoting participation, the political participation of the mass of people in a more frequent manner. I think that is important, because there's a lot of nihilism in the U.S. If I can excuse myself for bringing in Hegel and the phenomenology as a result of I guess the pain of the world. There's a few different movements that Hegel describes as responses to that. There's Stoicism, which you see it in the US, and the capitalist logic of, forget about everything else and just focus on what you're doing. You can make money regardless of what background you come from. There's skepticism, which I think is embedded in a lot of this nihilism. And then there's the unhappy consciousness, which is a full resignation and just an acceptance of the pain. And I do think that a lot of people have that going on, and that's going on a lot in a big part of the population in the US. As far as the consumerism being the opiate of the masses today, I do agree with that, and I think that we should have analysis of the role of consumerism and how it dulls political activity and helps people become to some extent okay with the exploitation that they are facing. I do think that there's a risk involved in emphasizing consumerism, and the risk is I think what ends up happening with like the Frankfurt School and with some of the new left, which, as I mentioned, Gabriel Rockhill's work, he shows that a lot of those people were funded by the leading capitalist foundations, by the state departments, and very much proliferated. And although I think they provide interesting ideas in terms of consumerism, they all end up, like Marcuse, they end up in this position that resembles a lot, I think, contemporary Maoism. And that's not to be confused with Mao Zedong thought, which is the one that's sustained in China, but which is based on this distortion of Lenin's notion of the labor aristocracy. Instead of the labor aristocracy being that upper strata of the working class, which dominates the working class organs of power and turns its back on the working class and promotes imperialism and aligns with the capitalist class because they get basically the crumbs of the super exploitation that's carried forth around the world and in the third world. Instead of that being the understanding of the labor aristocracy, which would warrant, as Lenin said, going into those unions and showing workers how the leaders of those unions are selling them out and are siding with the working class. The notion of the labor aristocracy, because of an analysis that's grounded on consumerism, manifested itself in Marcuse and in modern Maoism as the idea that the whole working class of the global north in the US and Europe is all part of one big labor aristocracy, and that the working class was fully absorbed into the apparatuses of capitalism, so much so that it wasn't anymore a revolutionary agent, but that it was an accomplice, the whole working class, not just the upper strata, an accomplice of imperialism. And ultimately what that leads is to political nihilism, right? It's like, what the hell are you supposed to do then for socialism if the working class cannot be revolutionary? You just put your hands in your pocket and just focus on publishing academic papers. So I do think we have to analyze consumerism, the role that it places in helping working people not be involved in political activity and how it makes them resignate to any form of revolutionary praxis. But we should be careful that it doesn't turn into the Marcuse modern Maoism pipeline.
Okay, next up is Richard Wright from the People's Republic of Texas, followed by Raj, followed by Peter Fay, followed by Sharon. So Richard, if you'd unmute yourself and ask your question.
It's revolution informing. Thank you for your presentation, Carlos. And in fact, you sort of led into, by design or by accident, I think more accident, one of my questions I had. And that is, I've been noticing lately, and maybe it's just exposure here. I'm not sure where it's coming from, but I've been noticing lately a spate of articles that have been sort of out of the well, they've been examining the state of the state of socialism, and in particular, there's been these articles out there about taking power without getting in the government, if you will, without political parties. I think Raj in his presentation last week sort of hit on this. I read an article in these Times where they talked about basically dropping out of political organizing and in favor of, I gather, I'm not sure actually, the John Holloway and David Graeber are two authors that are mentioned by these what I think are anarchists basically. And I was just wondering if you could maybe comment on this this tendency, this seems to be, back when I was growing up, I mean, it was taking part in politics. That seems to have been divorced. That seems to have been thrown aside. And I know it's not everybody, but I see elements of these people rising up in DSA, for example. Anyways, could you maybe address a little bit of that? Thank you.
Okay.
I think that's a approach to politics that was very distinctive of the anarchists and the ultra left segments of the Marxist left, which just I think want to fully ignore political participation. Now I think that somewhere a midpoint between the overemphasis on politics and the complete rejection of politics is the right place to be in. We should engage, I think, in bourgeois politics, but always because we understand that there's still a lot of working people there, and we should be showing them the limits of bourgeois politics and the fact that, even the reforms that are won within bourgeois politics are always susceptible because the capitalist class is still in power and dominates the state, of getting pulled back. So I do think that there needs to be political participation through the forms of parties. Now, I do think that that Marxism-Leninism is something that's creative, that the heart of it is not the conclusions, but the method and the outlook, which requires constant application and readjustment to changing conditions. That's why I mentioned earlier, like coalition parties, just because I've seen that in various parts of Latin America, it has worked. Now, how much have they worked? Have they worked like the Cuban Revolution worked? I wouldn't say that. There's still it's achieved socialist parties in power within a bourgeois state that is still susceptible to counter-revolution and reactionary practices and infiltration through imperialist interests. But I do think that we have to be creative in our approaches and think about what would be the most fitting way of participating in Marxist-Leninist politics today. I do think a vanguard party is something we need. Whether the vanguard party is embedded in a larger coalition party, I think only time and praxis would tell. I can't predict that, but my instinct would be to have that coalition party with a strong vanguard party at the front that focuses on political theoretical education. So any attempt at removing socialist politics from political praxis, I think is a mistake. I mean, Lenin told us that bourgeois politics from the lens of history is defunct. It's basically dead, but from the lens of the particular concrete conditions, insofar as a big portion of working people still buy into it, we have to participate in it. So that's my position today.
Okay, next is Raj, followed by Peter, followed by Sharon. So Raj, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
I have unmuted. Thank you, Carlos, for your talk. I want to bring up this question to you. I think when a revolution took place in Russia in the early part of the 20th century, Lenin wrote this several very important theoretically advanced it to the 20th century by saying imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, it would therefore has reached that, so therefore different tactic. In other words, the peasants became a bulwark for revolution behind workers, okay? China, Mao did the same, okay? But today, the situation is different, okay? And I think Mike Gilbert alluded to that in his address, is that the capitalist system, it buys out workers, at least in the Western countries, but globally, communism is set back. I mean, even in India, the working class as a left movement is set back. Who is ascendant? The right of center BJP, okay? Their federation of workers is now larger than the Communist Party of India, Marxist, which used to be the biggest. And they're still very substantial. But so here the whole ideology question comes up. I think theoretically, where we are lacking is that our vision of communism has become tainted with two things. One is with capitalism. So, for example, China. China is ruled by a communist party, but the system of production is capitalism. Workers are exploited. About 28% of the workers live on minimum wage in dormitory conditions of work. And therefore, but since the material benefit to workers has gotten better than before, it's considered a success. Well, this is not radical enough, in my opinion, for today, and has to take a real departure from there. I don't think you can say, we just want to run a better capitalism for you, so you'll have more stuff to buy. I think that is not a revolutionary outlook. So there is secondly, the amount of production is so massive now, unlike in case of Lenin's time, they could not satisfy a lot of workers in material needs. This has been done now by capitalist classes. So dominance of capitalism has increased, but the worker can survive, live in survival condition, except the global condition of survival, which is coming at the cost of ecology and pollution, environmental degradation. So that is the common they are using. So a much more radical analysis needed. And I like your comments on this, what I'm saying. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. You bring up very interesting points concerning the peasantry and the role of the peasantry, both in the Russian and the Chinese Revolution. I think it's important to understand that our guiding quote, the history of all hitherto existing society, is the history of class struggles, in plural, not struggle. It's not just trade union struggle or direct struggle in the way it looks in Europe or something. One of the things that's developed by Marx and Engels implicitly, it gets more developed by Lenin and Mao, but it really gets concretized by what I think to be, perhaps one of the best recent Marxist-Leninist philosophers, theorists, is Domenico Losordo, is the notion that class struggle, there's no such thing as a pure class struggle, that class struggle always takes a determinate form. And sometimes that looks a lot like the struggle against racism. Sometimes it looks like the struggle for national liberation. Sometimes, as Engels had mentioned, the first class struggle is the struggle of women against patriarchy. Sometimes it looks like a sex. So the class struggle takes different forms. And I think that part of concretely analyzing the concrete, which is our, what exists now, requires us to ask questions about, what form is the class struggle going to take in the US, and how is it going to differ from other places? As far as China, I think that it is important to remember that, socialism is a process. There's a lot of debates within the Chinese Communist Party, and there's there's left factions, not factions, but there's left tendencies within the party that are very critical of the role that capitalism has played as a tool for the development of the means of production, and there's right tendencies within the party. I think that since the emergence of Xi Jinping towards almost a decade ago now, the left wing has kind of won out, and that China has been radicalizing in a lot of areas towards something closer to what our ideas of socialism would posit the first stage of socialism to look like. There's still, of course, a sector of the economy that's capitalist, but it's very controlled. It's extremely controlled. There's Communist Party members within each corporation. It's controlled by the government. The existence of the market, as Xi Jinping puts it, there's the visible hand that controls the invisible hand, and we can't deny the success that they've had in raising 800 million people out of poverty, and in the last 10 years in reducing inequality and creating common prosperity, and in presenting a real threat to American global hegemony through win-win relations internationally in the sphere of the environmental sustainability. They're at the forefront. I mean, they've planted forests the size of Ireland. It's really impressive what they're doing, and some of the leading ecological Marxist theorists in the West, people like John Bellamy Foster, like Ian Agnes, they're looking to China to learn, right? And they're working with academics such as Cheng and Fu to learn how it is that they have achieved, I think, such successes, and for them more specifically in the field of the environment and ecology. So I do think that, China's not perfect, right? We shouldn't expect perfection, but we should expect a process. And I do think that we can see a process in China. We can see the development of socialism. And it's not only that we see it, right? It's that they're conscious of it. Like they're continuously expressing the fact that they're in a process of socialist construction, which doesn't necessarily have to immediately look like, what Marx called the first stage of communism in the Critique of the Gotha program, right? So I'm very supportive of China. There's some things that I'm a little bit critical of. I think internationally they could help Cuba more. I feel like the Soviet Union would have helped Cuba a hell of a lot more. But I do think that for a lot of socialists, it is becoming the sort of beacon of hope that the Soviet Union was for generations past.
Okay, next is Peter, followed by Jean, followed by Sharon, followed by Janet. So Peter, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question.
Well, you totally lost me there on China, but that's a whole nother discussion. Probably not, maybe not worth trying to resolve that today. But I was going to talk about something else, and that is, who is your audience? Who are you trying to talk to? Because I'm listening. I listened to you. I could have heard similar addresses by many different people on the same subject with similar types of analyses, which is great. It's interesting, but who are you trying to address? Who are you trying to win over? Because to me, it sounds like your audience is perhaps leftists. Maybe they're progressives. You talked about coalition with leftist parties, various parties who've probably not got more than 0.01% of the vote in a long time, maybe more. I don't know. Is your audience academics? Are they Maoists? To me, when I think about the role of communist analysis, a Marxist analysis, the audience is the revolutionary class. It is the proletariat. So I would think of, addressing right up front the needs of the proletariat, or the, their world. For example, the proletariat to me is not. I mean, it certainly includes maybe Starbucks you know, workers or Amazon workers or something, but more immediately and more significantly is it's the industrial proletariat that no one's talking to except for Donald Trump. You know, the proletariat that voted, you know, the deplorables you mentioned that voted for Trump, or the you know, the semi-fascists like myself who voted for Trump. Not that I like Trump, I just hate him less than I hated Hillary Clinton. But what about addressing you know, the immediate perspectives of the largest industrial producers in the country? You know, what would you say to the workers of, you know, Union Pacific, John Deere, Caterpillar, General Electric, you know, General Dynamics, Raytheon? I used to work for Raytheon. I used to work for the largest foundry in the aerospace industry. And to me, it's that is really what must be addressed. I really couldn't care less about whether a particular leftist party is adhering to the line, or, you know, whether I can convince a Maoist to join a coalition with me. That is insignificant and is not really addressing what needs to be addressed. And I did like the subject matter that you're looking at. You know, I like the fact that you're talking about, can the ruling class rule in the same old way? You know, is it unable to rule anymore? And I don't know what world you're living in, but in my world, they sure as hell are ruling in the same old way, and they are absolutely guaranteed to rule that way for quite some time still. They are not weak. They are not unable to continue their rule. They are ascendant and more powerful and capable today than they ever have been in my lifetime. They are making the British world and the German people, they're forcing them to commit suicide. They're destroying all of European production, energy supplies. They are destroying for their own benefit the West, you know, the leaders of the Western world. And this is their moment. This is their peak of their power. I agree, they will be broken sometime soon by China and Russia. Their dominance will be broken, but they are ascendant and they are ruling the world. And until such time as they make the foolish choice to go to war with Russia, if they do that, which I hope not, they are controlling the Western world, and they are perfectly happy. I am convinced they're perfectly happy to do it this way. So I just like your reaction to my perspective, which is a little bit different, I guess, but I think it's a challenge that really needs to be answered.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate your question and your challenge. There's a few things that I would like to address. I'm trying to figure out the order of through which I should address it. I'll start with your point about the industrial proletariat. I agree. I absolutely agree. If you look at the founding document for our institute, a big part of the proletariat that's being ignored is that part of the working class that's in the heartland that works at what I would consider to be the pressure points of capital, right? The real source from where most of the surplus is extracted. I think the real heart of any economy. And I think that part of the working class has been ignored. It hasn't been ignored by us, though. We have been very emphatically supportive of it. In fact, when the John Deere strikes were taking place, the videos that we made received millions of views, and they were shared around by working class people all across the Midwest. We worked with the UAW and with various unions and various local unions to get the strikers food and to do various things. So that's that. And besides that, you know, one of the best friends of the project, who's one of my personal best friends, he's currently right now one of the the leading voices in the rail strike. So we are very much involved in that sphere. We have friends in the up and coming leadership that are tied to our project. And we don't want that to signify an ignoring of the other struggles of the working class. We want to address all of them. But I do think that that section of the industrial proletariat has been ignored wrongfully by the dominant socialist groups, and maybe some other sections which are important and are exploited and should also be considered as part of the working class, but they've been overemphasized a bit. So when the mining strikes came up, we were doing the same thing, sharing videos that were shared around by hundreds of thousands of people, and donating the donations that we received from our institute to the striking miners, and working with the parties that were working at the forefront of helping the miners as well. So I do think that point is good, but it's also one of the things that we're doing, and that's part of our audience. But we don't just have one audience. We try to cast our net as wide as possible. And that's been in part the spirit of our project. We have, on the one hand, a TikTok account that's primarily headed by Eddie, but we have other folks from the Institute participate. And in this TikTok account, we've grown it in the past up to 400,000 views before we got banned, and then we got banned 2 other accounts, and now we're receiving censorship again. And we make videos there that are seen by hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes millions of people, and everyone has a cell phone now. The working class it's not just reading newspapers. They have a cell phone, and they engage with our work, and they share it around. And we've faced a lot of censorship for that, and a lot of attacks. It hasn't gotten anywhere near to what it was during the height of McCarthyism, where as some of the folks in our institute had to experience the FBI following them for 10 years. But we just had a comrade of ours get fired from her job because of her courageous work countering Ukrainian nationalist propaganda and the current narrative for the proxy war against Russia. We just had Eddie Smith. Yesterday, he got doxxed, which means that his private information was released by an account that has 1.5 million followers. And that account told their followers to send emails to Eddie's employer to get them fired. This has happened a few times to both Eddie and myself, and to other people in the Institute. So it's a broad audience. It's socialist militants. It's party people. Our Institute has people from all parties, from PSL, from PCUSA, from CPUSA. Most of the e-board is CPUSA. There's people from DSA. And I do think that transformation, that the paper specifically addresses what I consider to be some of the failures of the socialist left in doing precisely what you mentioned that we should be doing, addressing the working class directly. And I think that part of how we can do that successfully is overcoming the conditions, the errors which I have labeled as a result of the purity fetish. Yeah, I think we have to remember that this switch towards the financialization of capital investments that has occurred over the last few decades, it's grounded on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And at the source of everything, you have that part of the proletariat, which is engaging in work in the pressure points of capital, is the one that you reference. And that one has been ignored, but we're trying to address it as best as we can. But thank you for your question and for your challenge. But I do think a lot of what you mentioned, you are correct in mentioning.
Yes, Carlos, we didn't promise you that the questions would be easy, but you're doing a good job addressing them. Next up is, Jean, followed by Sharon, followed by Janet.
Okay, well, thank you so much. This has been a very interesting discussion, but I confess I am an intellectual, and it has been pretty intellectual. I'll just make a couple of observations. One is that there seems to be an 800-pound gorilla in the room that we don't mention, and that is racism. And we forget that America is a country that was founded in genocide and slavery. And you don't need critical race theory to understand that these continue to permeate our society. So that's one observation. The second one is on electoral politics. Here in California, we do have the Peace and Freedom Party, and I was a candidate for Congress several times with the Peace and Freedom Party. We would usually get around 3% of the vote or something, but at least we were able to get those ideas out of there. But our electoral system has changed considerably. So that's a big change that's gone on. Another thing here in California, in Oakland specifically, we have a very strong union, the ILWU, the International Longshoremen's Longshore Workers Union, which is, it made a conscious decision to integrate, and it's a black-white union, very much so. And they have, I mean, they're like the Rock of Gibraltar for the left here, because they can and do shut down the port in terms of for Nelson Mandela, for the Israeli ships and so on. So that gives us a certain situation here in Oakland, which we have a good, and of course we have the Marxist library here also. But anyway, we do have a very strong traditions here in Oakland. And I just wanted to make those observations and see what your response is on those points. Thank you so much again for the discussion.
Thank you for your question. I do agree that race has been one of these things that has been foisted on by the ruling class on workers quite deliberately. It's a poison that creates what Du Bois called a psychological wage for a part of the white working class, which for a very long time separated. It presented a sort of poison for interracial solidarity. And what we find is that the communist movement, more specifically the communist movement, even more than the Socialist Party, it was the CPUSA, has been at the forefront of the struggle against racism, and that I would like to consider with the framework of Losordo that those struggles for Black liberation are forms of class struggles, determinate forms through which the class struggle appears, right? If we consider the class struggle as the universal, it has to always be embodied in the concrete. And in our past, it has been embodied quite a bit as a form of race struggle for Black liberation. I do not want to undermine, however, the successes of the civil rights movement and the advances that were made with what I consider to be, almost a third American Revolution that was carried forth by the civil rights movement. And if we recall, the struggle and the movement of Martin Luther King Jr. himself entered a second phase right before he was killed. And that phase was the phase of class struggle, of emphasizing on economic struggle and class struggle. And I think that is the legacy that we have to pick up today. I do think that today the prime factor that's preventing working class solidarity, I don't think it's racism anymore. I do think that there were tremendous advances after the civil rights movement, and I've worked in the part of the country where it's supposed to be the most racist, and I don't see it. I don't see it amongst working people. I don't, there's very here and there, very random, but most of the places, most of the factories and the places where people work are diversified, and I don't see the sort of racism, the poisonous racism that divides the working class. I don't see it at play as much, and I think that's something that we should thank the civil rights movement for. I do still think that there's obviously racism in the state, and that the police, the violence of the state is disproportionately, it's disproportionately towards Black and brown people, and that should be addressed. But that should be addressed, as most struggles were in the past, as not limited to identity or race struggles, but also as forms of class struggle, right? Because it isn't very rich Black billionaires that are suffering the pain of the overwhelming majority of the Black community, which are workers. So those have to be phrased, I think, as forms of class struggle, as racism has to be seen, as Henry Winston used to call it, as one of the twin weapons of the ruling class. Anti-communism and racism go together. So that's what I would say in terms of that. I'm sorry, it's been a long day and I'm forgetting what the other part of your question was.
Well, there's the Peace and Freedom Party in California, and our favorite union here in Oakland, the ILWU.
Right. I think those are great developments, and
we're very fortunate, I think, here in the Bay Area.
Right. And I think that we have this series in our YouTube channel called Socialism on the Ballot, and one of the candidates that we interviewed, I'm forgetting his name, but his first name is Jose. He's from the PSL party, and he ran through the Peace and Freedom Party. So I think something like that would be a good model for other states to start looking at doing. But it's really hard to get on the ballot. I have a lot of friends that are in the Green Party and in PSL, and it's extremely hard to get on the ballot, especially in midterm times. There's friends of mine from the Communist Party that complain when we say that we shouldn't just be voting blue no matter who, and their main complaint is, well, where are the Green Party people on the ballot in the midterms? I mean, they're fighting to get on because it's been made impossible by the Democrats themselves, while they have been championing themselves as the champions of democracy, because they're quote unquote fighting against the attacks on voting rights from the Republican Party, while both parties are really attacking the voting rights, except that one wants to defend voting rights insofar as it means that the options are the Republican and the Democratic Party. So.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely right.
Okay.
Thank you.
What I'm going to ask people to do next up will be Sharon, Janet, Yusef, and Mark, and Norma. We only have about 10 more minutes on the main part of the program. Please keep your questions and comments down to about 2 minutes, and to give Carlos a chance to respond and others to ask. So Sharon, if you would please.
Thank you, Carlos, very much. I wanted to make just a couple comments. One is about what you we're talking about, the third party, the question of having left party on the ballot. I've always thought it was a mistake for the Communist Party to stop running candidates. I think the last time they did was in 1980 when Angela Davis was the vice presidential candidate. When I first moved to Washington from New York, it was in the early 70s. I was on a bus and I saw a placard that said, "Vote for peace, vote for justice, vote communist." And I was very impressed by that as a young Marxist at the time. And Angela Davis is still a cultural icon. There's a big exhibit about her life and her ideas at the Oakland Museum right now. And she still is very influential within the left, at least locally. The question of a labor aristocracy and how you mentioned that it's wrong to say that the entire working class of the North has been bribed, and as a labor aristocracy vis-a-vis the rest of the world, the people, working class of the world. And I agree with that criticism, and I confess that I once adhered to that. I mean, it's a Maoist concept along with the theory of the three worlds, and it's really wrong. And we should analyze that. We need to do a lot more work in talking about who is the labor aristocracy. There is one, but who really is it in the U.S. working class, and how they seem to be bribed by so little. They settle for such a small bribe. And finally, I wanted to ask, I have people in my life who are young and progressive in a lot of ways, but when I talk about China, they roll their eyes and they say, oh, the Chinese always lie about how you can't believe that. You know, when I talk about how relatively few cases of COVID deaths there are, I just get this eye roll of, oh, they always lie. How do you get past that? Or how do you advise us getting past that? Thank you.
Thank you. Really interesting comments. I will answer the last one first. You know, Roland Bohr, who's one of the leading Marxist-Leninist scholars in the Anglophone world, he teaches in China. He published recently a book that I would recommend everyone to check out. It's called Socialism with Chinese Characteristics, a guide for foreigners. And he goes in one chapter and just addresses all of the concerns from the West. And one of them is this, like, they're just lying, right? They're just lying about this, they're lying about that. And there's no evidence to show that they're lying, but the evidence is there to show that the people telling us that they're lying have lied a whole lot for a very, very long time. So I think the way that I usually approach it is by, you know, a lot of people are distrusting of the media. They know that they lie us into war constantly, and that they do that so that the military-industrial complex can benefit financially. A lot of I think asking questions like, do you think the same people that lied us into XYZ war is telling us the truth about China? What evidence do you have that the things that they are saying are true? And I think that usually people begin to, oh, okay, yeah, the same ones that I know for a fact lied to me about X, Y, and Z, why would I trust them about this other thing, right? And I think that's that Socratic process of getting people to come to know something through questioning. I think it's something that's very important. My one of our editors at the Institute, Noah Krashevic, he's a carpenter union guy. A lot of his coworkers had the same questions about China, and just through questioning and showing them information here and there, he was able to get them to change their mind. And when we started our work almost 3 years ago now, just to come out in favor of China was, you couldn't do it. But we've slowly worked, and I think that the atmosphere is much more acceptant now. People have come to understand that, like, the Uyghur genocide thing was BS, that it was unsubstantiated by any evidence. They have come to understand that the allegations of this authoritarianism from the party is absurd. You know, there's again, check out the work of Roland Bohr. He's got in the same book, but also other articles where he talks about the 7 structures of democracy within China and how they've been incorporating the ideas of the mass line. And it's wonderful stuff. It's not perfect. It never is perfect. We cannot expect purity, but I think that it's hard to study China concretely today without you know, all these baggages of biases from the West that just make us distrust the plethora of evidence that we can find. It's hard to engage in that and to not be supportive of China, even if at least critically. About the electoralism, I was part of the Bernie movement for the 2 times he ran, and nobody pulled in the history of American politics crowds like Bernie did. I'm sorry, but in 50 years from now, the people, if we're still struggling for socialism, then maybe, but we're going to look back at the Bernie movement as something to learn from. And, you know, why wait 50 years? Why wait 30 years? You know, it just happened. We just witnessed a political mobilization of millions and millions of Americans like never done before in general in politics, but more specifically in terms of socialist politics. We witnessed that with people that were identifying with the socialist label. Of course, it wasn't the socialism that we're talking about. It's, you know, what socialism? Well, look at the Scandinavian countries. That's Bernie. But anyways, it's people coming to accept, especially young people coming to accept the socialist label and willing to be mobilized in such a way as to fight for what they conceive to be socialism. I think that's something that we have to take very seriously and learn from. And we have to figure out, the way that we've been phrasing it is, how do we sublate Bernie? How do we take the elements of Bernie that mobilized millions of people and overcome the negative parts so that we create a movement which has the positive and that eliminates the negative, and that does it, I think, by necessity outside of the two-party system. I do agree as far as the CPUSA. I think not running candidates is a mistake. But I do want to say that in California, there was a candidate, Stephen Estrada, a good friend of our institute. He was running a wonderful campaign, and unfortunately, he didn't get any support from the national party, to the point where he felt like the party was itself becoming a fetter to the activities that I believe it's the Harry Bridges Club, named after the famous longshoreman and unionist, to the point where he felt like the best thing that he could do for his local organizing was to leave the party. I don't agree with that assessment, but I respect him, and I do agree with your point that the CPUSA should look at running candidates, and if candidates are running, to support them, right? Because Stephen unfortunately wasn't supported.
Okay, next is Janet, followed by Yusef and Mark. Janet, if you would go ahead, please.
Okay, thanks. Oh, and what about all the lies the U.S. feeds us? Anyway, thank you, Carlos, for such an amazing presentation and for your work. I'm not a Marxist scholar, nor am I fluent in the jargon. I'm more or less someone who many decades ago, once I had met up with some people who identified as socialists, and I joined a study group, I realized that I've been a socialist, small s, all my life. That said, I want to say that I agree with what Peter raised about who your audience is. And in that light, I think that something else that is needed in order to accomplish what you described is a current day and relatively simple statement or manifesto that spells out what living in a socialist country or world would be like, what everyday life would look like, including examples that exist or have existed, like Social Security, single-payer health care, if not socialized medicine, social housing, the 8-hour workday, probably it no longer exists, and so forth. So what also should be spelled out is how to get there from here. Something like this should be widely distributed to the industrial proletariat. And I'm wondering, does Midwestern Marx have something like this, or are you working on it?
Thank you again for a wonderful question. I do agree, and we are working on pamphlets that we can like mass hand out, and something like what socialism would look like today. What I mean, we have to understand that poll after poll shows that the most popular president in U.S. history, even today, is FDR, and that he's the only guy that's been elected 4 times in a row. They had to put term limits in order to stop him from getting elected. And FDR wasn't a socialist, but he was a friend of socialists. He had the backing of the Communist Party, of the Socialist Party, of the labor unions, which at that time were heavily communist, and he was a friend of the Soviet Union. And why is it that the president that we've had that has been the most overwhelmingly popular amongst the American people is the one that has been the closest to socialism? Why is it that the few things that we have, if they haven't been rolled back over the last 50 years of neoliberalism, the few things the American people have that they enjoy, it was won by socialists, and it was won by trade unionists and the working class. It wasn't handed to us from the capitalists. It was won through struggles. And I think those things, we have to recapture them. And I think in the part of my presentation where I talk about recapturing the positive history of American socialism, that is a part of it, right? The few things that we have that we like, it came from socialists, and the one president that people still enjoy the most was the one closest to a socialist. I think PSL recently did something like that. It's a book that's been shared around called Socialist Reconstruction. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. I've seen a few book panel presentations on it. There's a lot of things that I agree with it. There's other things that maybe I would phrase things differently, but I do think some form of a current day manifesto, some form of a developing project for what socialism would look like, the current history that we have, how socialism has played a role in American history, and how we can get to what we posited as what socialism would look like. Something like that would absolutely be necessary, and it's something that I think you could expect our publishing press to cook up for 2023.
Okay, Yusuf, and let's see, Mark. So Yusuf, please.
Yeah, and incidentally, my name is Yusuf. As you can see,
I'm sorry, Yusuf. I'm sorry. Sorry.
As you can see, there is no E.
Okay.
Very good presentation. Thank you. One comment is that I think it was Lenin who pointed this out. It's not just the absolute strength of the working class, but it's also the relative strength vis-a-vis the strength of the ruling class. And so that's why I think he argued that revolution will be in Russia rather than in Europe, although the working class is not so developed in Russia. So the US ruling class is very, very entrenched still, and its institutions are entrenched. Whereas in Latin America, the country I come from, Turkey, and so on, the institutions are not entrenched. So you could, one should, I guess, be more charitable to the American left, is that they, no matter how good they do things, how that they get a good program and so forth, I mean, they're still facing formidable odds, a formidable enemy. So that would be my comment, and I would like your response. And second, could you tell some political parties or movements who got it right, so we could maybe emulate them?
Thank you for your question, and I do agree. We do have a very formidable enemy, as you nicely put it. It's a monster that I don't think many socialist struggles around the world in the past have had to face. It's a ruling class that is very entrenched. It has a lot of power. It has a lot of dominance, a lot of resources, and it's used those resources to stop socialist struggles abroad and at home. But I do think that there's a genuine crisis of legitimacy going, and a big part of how they're able to perpetuate the existing order is legitimizing themselves, right? A lot of people buy into or bought into the idea that this is a democracy, that there's freedom, and all the other bourgeois notions that they've indoctrinated us with since we were babies. And I think more and more people are rejecting those ideas, and that is, I think, inevitably going to create the conditions wherein the crisis of legitimacy turns into a more profound crisis of authority. But I do think it's a very formidable enemy that we have. And look, the struggle for socialism in the U.S. is perhaps as internationalist as a struggle can take, because if we're able to overthrow this monster, we're not just overthrowing the exploiters of the American people, but we're overthrowing the monster that has prevented socialism to flourish peacefully around the world. So the stakes are very high for American communists. But yeah, I think that there's cracks and there's spaces of leakages that we can begin to see, and I wouldn't be surprised if we're able to take advantage of those and help it pop. Maybe that's just youthful optimism. I don't know, but yeah.
Well, thank you. I think what we're going to do now is we're going to stop the recording, but continue people who have questions. I want to thank you, Carlos, for one of the most informative and stimulating presentations and discussions that we've had. And we really look forward to working with you and Eddie and others from Midwestern Marx in the future. And just thank you so much for coming and presenting. We really appreciate it. So let's go ahead and stop the recording, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.